Well, when I found out that I won, I think I was just really shocked. And actually, when I told my partner, her response was, "Are you sure?" And when I told my mum, that was her response as well. And so I sort of had to go back and sort of check that actually I hadn't just sort of completely misunderstood the communication, and actually it was true. So yeah, mainly just shock. Yeah. I think I had always wanted to be a writer, and I think I'd always sort of had this probably quite unjustifiable sort of conviction that at some point, you know, I would write a book. And but I think it was really just procrastination. I think I'm just the kind of person who, when I was at university and I did essays, I'd always do them the night before. And when I did my PhD, I sort of did nothing for years and years, and then sort of wrote the whole thing in a couple of months. And I think that sort of on a macro scale, it was a bit like that. I think I just sort of thought at some point I would start writing, but I just kept deferring it. And I think sort of 3 or 4 years ago, it just suddenly occurred to me that if I was going to do this, I'd better get on with it. So mainly motivated by panic now at this point. So yeah. Actually, what I really wanted, and what I still want, is to be a novelist, because I think I've always really loved novels. And the reason I started writing short stories was I got accepted to do an MA in creative writing at Victoria University here in Wellington, and I decided that it would be a bit reckless to try and write a novel, because I was pretty much a beginner, and I suppose I thought that I would be putting all my eggs into one basket, and if it sort of crashed and burned, then the year would be a disaster. So I thought I'd sort of hedge my bets a bit and write short stories and use that as a way to sort of learn about fiction. And I think that through that process I got really interested in the short story as a form. And so when I finished that year, I had thought that I was going to then sort of set off and try and write a novel, but what sort of happened is that I've found that I've gone back and I've reworked and reworked the stories I wrote that year, and yeah, without quite meaning to, I've ended up with sort of, you know, probably 2/3 of a collection of stories. So now my aim is to get that published as a book, and then probably to move on to a novel. The reason I entered Two Girls in a Boat into the Commonwealth short story competition, I think, was because at the time it was a story that felt like it was finished, and also I suppose it seemed like a good choice because the main character in the story, Hannah, she's sort of stuck between two worlds really. She's been living in the UK and she's moved back to New Zealand, and I suppose that kind of cross-cultural sort of theme seemed like something that might be interesting to explore in the context of a Commonwealth. Inspiration for this story actually came from, it was probably unusual in that I just found myself, I sat down and I wrote the first probably page of the story, just sort of came out in a great big kind of rush, and the story just seemed to have a kind of a momentum that just sort of carried it through. So actually, probably of all the stories I've written, this one came out the first time closest to how it was going to be. I tend to work out the structure of the story as I write, so I'm actually really interested in structure, and I'm sort of a very analytic kind of person, and I'm quite into sort of you know, drawing little geeky tables and things and working out how things fit together. But I certainly wouldn't do that in advance of writing a story. I tend to kind of write and then kind of think about the structure as I go and do the two things in parallel. But yeah, I am really kind of fascinated by the way that fiction is constructed. So where a story starts and where it ends, and how you decide which point of view to use, and you know, just the shift that you can create in a story from changing it from past tense to present tense. And often, for me, the process of writing a story is actually kind of trying to get that right, trying to get all those structural things right. And I think you can only really do that through the process of writing. I don't think you can plan it out in advance, because then you just end up with something really programmatic. I'm really lucky because I've got a really good group of writer friends that I did my MA with, and also I have other writer friends who many of whom I haven't actually met because they live in other countries, but who I've come to know online through various sort of forums and things. And so when I write, I do definitely exchange, I give my drafts to trusted people to read and get feedback, and also do the same for them, and I find that quite a useful process. But I think that it's a bit of a double-edged sword getting feedback, because you have to write the story that you want to write, and I think I find it useful to have other people read my stories and let me know, I guess give me their response as a reader so I can understand whether the story's doing what I wanted it to. But I think as I've got more confident with my writing, I've probably started to rely more and more on my own judgment, and I think that it's a bit of a slippery slope trying to write to get kind of to get good feedback from the people around you, because then you're not going to end up with your story. It seems to me that there's almost the convention in short stories that your protagonist will have an epiphany, so they'll have, probably towards the end of the story, they'll suddenly gain some insight into who they really are, or what they really want, or how things are, and the story often sort of vindicates that. And there's this idea that we have these sort of moments of insight where everything becomes clear, and I think that I actively resisted that when I was writing the story. And I think the main character, Hannah, in the story, actually for a lot of the story isn't quite sure what she wants or what is the right thing to do, and the story ends with her still not really sure. And I think that it's often only really in retrospect that we can kind of try and construct these narratives in our lives where we see these turning points and these moments at which it became clear to us what our destiny was. And actually I don't think life's really like that, and so I wanted to write a story that was true to life in that sense, but still had, I guess, the kind of arc that you would expect from a piece of fiction. It's difficult to say which writers have influenced me, I think, because I don't think that the influence is conscious. I certainly haven't set out to imitate another writer, but I think that sometimes you see the influences afterwards rather than at the time. I mean, I know there are a lot of writers whose work I really enjoy reading, and I don't know if I've necessarily wanted to write like them, but I've been reading quite a few short stories lately, and I really like the work of Kelly Link and Laurie Moore and David Foster Wallace. Some of his short stories I find completely unreadable, others I think are just completely brilliant. It's interesting because we're possibly the last generation that will ask ourselves that question, because we're shifting over to e-books, and I think in some ways if a book got lost, so what, I'd just buy another book because you can get the text, but the actual object you can't. The idea of a book as an object is something that I think we have been quite attached to, and so probably I have a copy of Pride and Prejudice that I sort of read and reread and reread as a teenager, and I'd probably want to keep that, because not so much for the text but just because of the actual object of it.